Okay, now let me turn this over to our host, Professor Joshua Shaines, Director of the Arnold Center for Israel Studies and Associate Director of the Jewish Studies Program, who will introduce our guest and moderate the discussion. Josh?
Thank you, Yaron. It's really my pleasure as the director of the Center for Israel Studies to introduce today's guest. And let me just say, one of the things we try to do at the center is to bring a wide array of speakers over the course of the year and the coming years. Some of you might have joined us last semester for Peter Beinart's presentation after his article came out. And as Yaron mentioned, he'll be talking with Nachman Shai coming up in the coming weeks. So I hope you're able to join us for all of those. And all of these events are available on our website and will be available to stream as well on the Facebook page. Today's speaker, Yossi Klein Halevi, is a senior fellow at the Shalom Hartman Institute in Jerusalem. Together with Imam Abdullah Antepli of Duke University, he co-directs the Institute's Muslim Leadership Initiative, which teaches emerging young Muslim American leaders about Judaism, Jewish identity, and Israel. I don't have time to discuss all of he's published many books and certainly many more articles than that. His 2013 book, Like Dreamers, won the Jewish Book Council's Everett Book of the Year Award. And his latest book, which we'll be discussing today at some point, is Letters to My Palestinian Neighbor, a New York Times bestseller. And he's written for pretty much all of the important papers and journals you probably read. He's certainly had articles in them over the years. His first book, Memoirs of a Jewish Extremist, tells the story of his own teenage years, which I hope he'll discuss a little bit now, following the militant right-wing Rabbi Meir Kahane and his later disillusionment with Jewish radicalism, something the New York Times called a, quote, book of burning importance. He was born and raised in Brooklyn. He moved to Israel in 1982 and lives in Jerusalem with his wife, Sarah, and has 3 children. And it's really my absolute delight to have him with us today. Thank you so much for joining us. Yossi.
Thank you, Professor Shaines. Truly appreciate it. Appreciate the invitation.
It's a delight. So why don't I begin, since not everybody knows you and your background, if you want to take a few minutes to talk about your own personal story and how you got to where you're at now, ideologically and otherwise.
Well, hi, everyone. Greetings from Jerusalem. I guess you're asking me to go back about 45, 50 years. It really feels like several lifetimes ago, but I'll try. I grew up in a neighborhood called Borough Park, which has been in the news quite a bit lately. It is probably the largest ultra-Orthodox neighborhood in America. And when I was growing up, it was primarily a concentration of Holocaust survivors. And my family was a survivor family. And that experience shaped my identity. And you know, Josh, it's really interesting to think that the separation between now and then, and we're going back to the 1960s, 50 years, was what I thought of World War I. You know, World War I was even more distant. And the Holocaust was almost contemporaneous. The Holocaust had ended 15, 20 years earlier. And so all of Jewish life was shadowed by an event that most Jews didn't speak about. Most Jews didn't know how to speak about the Shoah, certainly most American Jews, because whatever aspirations American Jews had about entering mainstream society, about being accepted in a non-Jewish milieu, the Holocaust was antithetical to the American Jewish dream, the American Jewish ethos. And so there was almost total silence. My father was one of those very rare survivors who spoke nonstop about his experiences. And since very few people really wanted to listen in those years to survivors, I was his principal audience. I was his coerced audience. I had no choice. So I heard all of his stories, and I absorbed all of his anger. And I saw myself as a kind of vicarious contemporary to my father, which is very much how he raised me. And so I had this tremendous baggage, and I was looking for some way to unpack it, to neutralize it, to direct it. And Mayor Kahana came along in 1968, founded an organization called the Jewish Defense League, borrowed all of the radical left-wing rhetoric of the 60s. Instead of black is beautiful, Jewish is beautiful. Instead of black power, Jewish power, and enticed my generation of teenagers who were trying to figure out, how do you put together the Holocaust, the 60s, the Six-Day War, which had just happened, all this convergence of tremendous forces. It's a period of American Jewish history which is almost completely forgotten. But for a few years, there was this eruption of rage on the fringes of the American Jewish community, a phenomenon that the American Jewish community had never seen before or since. It was an expression of a very particular moment in American Jewish history, when the generation of the children of survivors were coming of age. The Soviet Jewry movement was just taking off. And Kahana offered us a way to deal with our anger. And we were a group that prided ourselves on being thugs, on being tough Jews. This was the ethos. And it was so antithetical to the American Jewish norm, or what Mayor Kahana used to call nice Irvings, which is his way of putting down the assimilationist longings of American Jews. And so we, for a few years, we were a kind of a violent aberration in the midst of this community that was really just trying to move from the Bronx and Brooklyn to Long Island. And we were the stick in the spoke. And Kahana for me was the voice of my father. He took my father's rage and brought it to the streets, brought it to the front page of the newspapers, and legitimized Jewish rage. And that period lasted in my life for about 4 years. And I wrote my first book, as you mentioned, tells the story of that forgotten period of American Jewish history, and it tells it from a very personal perspective.
And what led you to abandon that, and what did you embrace in its place? And this is connected to Israel, obviously, because at that point you're moving to Israel soon thereafter.
Yeah, I moved to Israel in 1982. It took me about a decade to deprogram from extremist politics, and it really was a process of deprogramming. And a major part, I mean, there were seminal experiences along the way, but a major shift in consciousness for me was the realization that I actually was not my father's vicarious contemporary. That the gap between my father's experience as being part of the unluckiest generation in Jewish history, 4,000 years of Jewish history, my father's generation was the unluckiest. My generation was the luckiest generation in Jewish history. I grew up with a sovereign state of Israel in the freest, most secure diaspora that Jews have ever known. In the 1960s, for God's sake, it was the most exciting time culturally, musically, politically. And I was very connected to the 60s. I was a bit young to really partake of Haight-Ashbury and the civil rights movement, but emotionally I was there, and I followed this all very keenly. And so Kahana was a kind of a surrogate, a distorted version of the 60s, but then again, the 60s was also a distorted version of the 60s. So it was really the realization that I had to live my time. And for me to be living as a traumatized post-Holocaust Jew was not being faithful to my experience. It wasn't owning my experience. And to fast forward, I went to college. I actually met non-Jews, which is growing up in Borough Park and in the circles that I grew up in, the survivor circles and then the militant Jewish circles. I didn't know any non-Jews, basically till college. And I grew up in a shtetl, and entering into the American mainstream, I went to Northwestern to study journalism in the mid '70s, and that was really a transformative experience. And realizing just how American I was, even though I had grown up in a place that is nominally the United States of America, but is actually somewhere between the US and Hungary. But I really was an American. And it's a long story, but I guess that's the very, very condensed version. You asked me what I gravitated to. I know people of a similar background as mine who went from the extreme right to the extreme left. I also know people who grew up extreme left, who grew up in the SDS or on the other far left movements of the 60s and 70s, who ended up far right. Think of David Horowitz, the former editor of the far left Ramparts, who's now one of the leading Trump supporters, and so it's a certain personality. Extremism is more of an emotional tendency than it is necessarily an ideological tendency. And I realized that I actually wanted to live a more nuanced life. I wanted to listen. I wanted to understand perspectives that weren't mine. What I realized was that I had a curious personality. And a fanatic isn't curious. A fanatic knows whatever you need to know. He's got it down. The beginnings of a process of subversion, where you subvert your certainties, is curiosity. And so I really was curious about the left. I was curious about the center. I was curious about non-Jews. I was curious, and I became a journalist, which is a very good profession for satisfying your curiosity. And if you do your job properly as a journalist, you have to learn. You have to listen. I just saw I read an obituary about Larry King, who just died, and it was a great line where he said, "I never learned anything when I was talking," and he was a great listener. That's really what made him a great interviewer. Mm-hmm. And so you listen, and you're curious, and you start to realize, okay, I have a certain perspective. I have a certain life experience, and that I believe that that's worth something. But there's lots of variation out there. The human experience is endless. And the kind of journalism that I ended up doing in Israel was really writing about people across the political and cultural spectrum from personal perspectives. What is it in your life experience that brought you to the settlement movement? What is it in your life experience that brought you to the peace movement? So rather than start with what you believe now, I want to understand the process that led you to where you are. Because I know that my own process, I for the last 30 years for sure, I position myself very firmly in the center because I really see the center as that place of creative ambiguity where you can really try to figure out who is offering valuable insights on any given issue. And the center is, there was a great Hebrew poet, Chaim Guri, an Israeli poet, who wrote, one of his seminal poems was, I am a civil war, Ani milchemet achim. And that's a fantastic poem. And in some ways, that's the credo of the center. I'm a civil war. I've got elements in me still that are right wing. I have elements that are left wing. And when I do the calculations, I end up somewhere in the center.
That's great. Thank you. I want to follow up in a second with your last book, but before I do, I forgot to mention to our audience, the chat function is open for you to send questions to me. So if you click on the bottom on chat, find my name, Joshua Shanes, and send me your questions, and I would be very happy to forward them along to our guest. So as you think of them, no need to wait. They'll be there waiting for me to read. So please go ahead and send those questions in as they come to you. I'd like to ask you, your last book, Letters to My Palestinian Neighbor, which is right here. If you want to talk just for a couple minutes about the ideology behind the book. I know that you did translate it into Arabic so the Palestinians could actually read it, but I'm curious about the English version specifically, right? You didn't release it principally in Arabic, you released it principally in English. So the audience was there for English speakers and English readers. So I'm curious what you hope to accomplish and argue thereby in the book. And you can speak as well about your vision if you at the same time in the book.
Sure. Well, the truth is that the book was released simultaneously in English and Arabic. It was placed online for free downloading in Arabic. And I've had thousands of downloads, hundreds of long responses. I set up a website in Arabic and English. The book really began, it began in the middle of the night because of insomnia.
Great book.
Maybe so. And I live in a very strange place in Jerusalem. I live in a neighborhood called French Hill, and I live in literally the last row of houses in French Hill, which is also the last row of houses of Northeast Jerusalem. So this row of houses is the border between Jerusalem and the West Bank. On the next hill, where I'm looking at now, I'm looking at the lights of a Palestinian village. That's the West Bank. And we are separated by a wall, the security barrier that Israel built during the Second Intifada when the 4 years of suicide bombings, and that's right outside my window. And late at night, I'd be sitting here looking out at the lights, listening to the muezzin, the call to prayer, and having these conversations in my head with an imaginary neighbor on the next hill whom I didn't know, who I wished I knew. Who am I? I'd like to explain to you who I am. I should just give a little bit of background to this because in the late 1990s, I went on a year-long journey into Palestinian society. As a journalist, and I published a book about it in 2001 called At the Entrance to the Garden of Eden. And it was a journey in search of the Palestinian story, as an Israeli, I wanted to listen to Palestinians. And I, in particular, as a religious Jew, I wanted to experience something of Islam. And I went into mosques. I participated in the Muslim prayer line with my kippah. It's inconceivable today, but that's somehow it was possible then. The book really was the story of a pilgrimage into my neighbor's story, my neighbor's experience, into the occupation, into the hard stories, but also into the faiths of my neighbors, Christianity and Islam, both. And so the book that I ended up writing now, Letters to My Palestinian Neighbor, is in a certain sense a sequel. In the previous book, I went out to listen. I wanted to hear the Palestinian story. In this book, I'm trying to explain to my neighbors who I am. Who are the Jews? Why did we come back home? Why do we believe that this land that we share with the Palestinian people is also our home? Why do we believe that we're not a colonialist invasion, but an indigenous people that returned home? And so these are the issues that I deal with in the book. The book is very much about identity. It's an attempt to try to explain to Palestinians the connection between Judaism as a religion, the Jews as a people, Israel as a nation state. How do all of these seemingly jagged pieces actually fit together in a coherent identity? And so it is, in a way, an attempt by an Israeli to begin a conversation with Palestinians. Now, the hardcover edition, which I think is the one you have, right?
Yeah.
Josh, the one?
Yeah.
The hardcover edition is composed of 10 letters, each on a different aspect, either of our conflict, what I believe are the possible ways of solving this conflict, but especially the elements of Jewish and Israeli identity. In the paperback edition, which came out about a year and a half ago, I published a 50-page new epilogue of responses from Palestinians. And the paperback edition, in a sense, models the kind of conversation I was hoping to initiate. So you have a strong Jewish and Zionist narrative, that's my position. And then I open up the pages to the counter narrative. And one of the difficult decisions that I had to make was, do I answer those letters in the book or do I let them stand? In other words, do I give the Palestinian narrative the last word in a book that I wrote to defend my own story? It wasn't an easy decision, but in the end, I felt that I needed to honor the people who responded to me by giving them the last word. And I also felt there was a message, a subliminal message that I was trying to send in this era of toxic communication, where you're not supposed to engage your political opponent. You're supposed to defeat, humiliate, ridicule your opponent. Your opponent is your enemy. And I felt there was something countercultural in giving my opponent the last word in my own book. So the book really now is an attempt to model what a respectful disagreement, because we do not agree. Palestinians and Israelis, we don't agree about anything. We don't agree about 1948 and who started this conflict. We don't agree about 1967, the Six-Day War. We don't agree who's responsible for the collapse of the peace process. We disagree about everything. This book now, in its latest edition, attempts to model a respectful disagreement over irreconcilable narratives. How do we nevertheless listen with respect to a narrative that we deeply disagree with? That, in the end, is really what this book is trying to do.
I'm wondering if you mentioned that, as a journalist, you want to learn from others, and the modeling is certainly admirable. But I'm wondering if there were letters that were sent to you, either those you published or maybe those you didn't, where I'm sure instinctively your response is to counter it, and as you said, or to let it stand because that's a difficult decision. But were there times where you said, you know what, you're right, I was wrong about that. You raised a very good point. Just as you hope, I assume that sometimes they'll listen to you and say, you know what, I can't agree with you about everything, but that it was a good one and I'm going to change because you said it. I mean, hopefully discourse is not just about sort of a pontification, but also about influencing each other in some measure.
So look, Josh, I've been involved with this story, this conflict, for 40 years. I've lived it as a protagonist. I joined the Israeli side. I was a soldier. I'm a citizen. I'm a passionate Israeli. I'm a Zionist. I also experienced this conflict as a journalist, trying to understand both sides. I also experienced this conflict as a pilgrim going into Palestinian Islam. And finally, I've experienced this conflict as a reconciliation activist. So if you put all of those very different aspects together, uh, it really creates a varied field of experience. So what I'm trying to say is that there's very little that anyone who's been immersed in this conflict for that long will suddenly hear and say, "Oh, wow, I didn't." We tend to regurgitate the same arguments. Uh, the professionals involved in this conflict and argue, the professional gladiators, we all know. We all know each other's argument. You can wake me up in the middle of the night and I can deliver a 2-hour lecture on the Palestinian narrative.
What's the in your mind, what's the value of the discourse? If you feel that, and in a second, by the way, I'm going to ask you so you can prepare in the back of your head. Some people are asking more about the Palestinian responses, but before we get to that, what's your value of the discourse? If you feel like I know my position, I know your position, we all know everything. I'm not moving, you're not moving. What do you find to be the value of that discourse if that's the case?
It's not the facts that's going to change anyone. It's the emotional texture of each other's stories. I was profoundly changed by encountering some of the Palestinian stories that were sent to me and in making friends. I've now made friends with some of the letter writers. I did a campus tour with one of them in the US. I made a film with another one of the letter writers. We did, it's on my website. The website is letterstomyneighbor.com. And there's a 3-part short film, 5 minutes segments, 5-minute segments. The first is my story. The second is the story of Muhammad Dajani. And the third is our meeting. All of which is encapsulated in 15 minutes. But I was emotionally transformed by being forced to see this conflict through my neighbor's eyes. I was forced to see this conflict through the eyes of the occupied. Now, it's not that I didn't know that there's an occupation. It's not that I haven't experienced it. I experienced it certainly as a soldier. I experienced it as a journalist. Over the last year, since the second Intifada, and Yaron, I heard you mention that you're going to be having a session on the collapse of the Israeli left. Yeah. The Israeli left imploded during the second Intifada, the 4 years of Palestinian suicide bombings. And what destroyed the Israeli left was not just the terrorism. It was the Israeli feeling that we had really tried to make a fair deal. We had offered the Palestinians statehood. We had offered to redivide Jerusalem, and we got back 4 years of suicide bombings. Now, whether or not you agree with that narrative, that is the normative Israeli story. And I personally deeply believe that narrative as well. That is my narrative. And so if you believe that your side, again, leave aside for a moment whether that's true or not, but if you believe that your side really offered a serious compromise and got the worst wave of terrorism in response in our history, then the response will be the emotional equivalent of the wall outside my window. I don't want to see you. I don't want to hear about you. If you're complaining about the occupation, go complain to your leaders, because they could have ended this situation 20 years ago. They could have ended it at Camp David. They could have ended it by accepting the Clinton proposal 6 months later. And so for many years, like most Israelis, I shut down. I didn't see. and I write that in the book, that my eye learned how not to see. And that's a very particular quality of being in an existential conflict where you personally feel threatened. You teach yourself to see selectively. And so what this book did for me, the experience was it jolted me out of my self-imposed defense mechanism. I would almost call it an ideological stupor. I did not want to see. And now I'm seeing. Now I'm very much engaged. It's not that now I realize that, wait a minute, Yasser Arafat really intended to make peace and it was Ehud Barak who screwed up. It's not on that level. My basic narrative has survived this experience of encountering the Palestinians more or less intact. But what's profoundly changed is my obtuseness. I can't pretend that the consequences of occupation are being played out somewhere far away. They're being played out here. And I have a responsibility. We all have a responsibility. But when my government expands settlements, that's my responsibility. And so this encounter has made me more empathic to the Palestinians and more committed to trying to stop annexation. And so, for example, when this summer, when Netanyahu was threatening to annex large parts of the West Bank, I was very involved in doing what I could, both in terms of public writing and lobbying behind the scenes, to try to do whatever I could to stop the annexation from happening. So I feel I have an investment in trying to keep open the possibility of a two-state solution that I did not have before this encounter. So again, Josh, even though my narrative didn't change, I changed.
Right. Well, I appreciate that. I mean, that's part of what we try to do at the center as well, is to bring all these different voices. Because even if somebody isn't changed by it, they are changed by it, right? Even if they're not persuaded, they're changed.
Right.
Which I think is
a good way to put it. Right.
Even if you're not persuaded, you're changed. And I think that's a great distinction. I wonder if I can ask you, thinking about the future, people are asking about the sort of, I'd say in Yiddish, the metzius, like the reality on the ground. When you talk about, on the one hand, since the Second Intifada, Israelis don't want to know about what's going on in the occupation, although their children are living it, are monitoring it and are there as soldiers and as settlers, right? We now have over 500,000 Jews in the West Bank, not just East Jerusalem, all over. So I guess my question, there seems to be a danger, on the one hand, not wanting to know, which I understand your reasons for why people don't want to know, but on the other hand, the settlements are growing and it's continuing to entrench itself. So I wonder, so it seems to me what you're trying to accomplish could be a good thing, that people need to wake up and not be, one criticism I've gotten, I'm somewhere in between you and Peter, so I'm sort of, I don't know where that puts me exactly, center left or whatever, but it seems to me one criticism I've heard is when things are...
I'm center. You're talking about Peter Beinart?
Yes, he was our guest.
I'm center. Peter Beinart is outside the framework of this debate.
He was he was the most left-wing person we've ever had. But in any event, for me, that what I don't know how to answer is when people say, look, when the Palestinians just live their lives under occupation, which is a very difficult life under military occupation, then people don't want to know about it since the Second Intifada. But if there is any kind of violence, then the response is, well, let's clamp down further. So I guess my question is, what's your vision, not of the ultimate solution, not of the two-state solution, but what's your more immediate vision of what has to happen? What's your...
Well, I would like to see a freeze on settlement building, certainly outside the areas we call the settlement blocks, which are, excuse me, close to the old border and are likely to be part of any land swap with the Palestinian state. areas outside the blocks should be frozen. I think the Obama administration made an enormous mistake by going head to head with Israel on building in Jewish neighborhoods in East Jerusalem. It was ludicrous. There isn't an Israeli government, left, right, or center, that wouldn't be building in all parts of Jerusalem, and they never had a chance to make headway. But I think the Biden administration should definitely confront my government on settlement building outside the blocks. So that's first of all. Secondly, I think we need to restore some sense of balance to the Palestinian-Israeli-American triangle. I do want to see America reaching out more to the Palestinians. At the same time, I think that there are certain very significant lessons that the Palestinian leadership should have learned over the last 4 years. And that is that the Middle East is moving on. And the fact that much of the Arab world no longer wants to be held, frankly, by Palestinian blackmail and wants normal relations with Israel. This should be a wake-up call to the Palestinian leadership. You can't keep holding the Middle East in a deep freeze of permanent enmity. And what I would like to see the Palestinian leadership ask themselves is, well, maybe we should have accepted the Clinton plan in December 2000. Maybe that was a mistake. Maybe, given the fact that there is no way that any Israeli government will ever accept the notion of the descendants of Palestinian refugees moving to Israel, maybe we should forego that demand and concentrate on what's possible, which is a Palestinian state more or less in the 67 borders. I don't think that the Clinton borders are possible anymore. That was 20 years ago. But I think that the Trump plan is also a little bit too tilted to the Israeli side. The Palestinians will need somewhere between Trump and Clinton. But I want to see what we call in Hebrew a cheshbon nefesh, an accounting, a self-reckoning. I think we need a self-reckoning on the Israeli side as well. We need a self-reckoning, which is this really the country that we want in the long term? Do we really want to be ruling over another people indefinitely? Is that why we came home? So we need a self-reckoning. We need to stop and say, where is this going? The Palestinian leadership, the Abraham Accords, the peace agreements that we've just signed with the Gulf states, with Morocco, this is a turning point. This is a major moment in the history of this region. These are the first genuine normalization accords that Israel has ever signed with Arab countries. We now have Arab allies, actual allies. With Egypt and Jordan, we had formal, cold, distant peace, barely peace. We now have real relations. I recently joined a think tank in Abu Dhabi. I'm a fellow in the Trends think tank in Abu Dhabi. It's unbelievable. If you would have told me that 4 months ago, there's a think tank in Abu Dhabi and they're going to invite Israelis to become fellows. I would have thought, it's a fantasy. And I want to see the Palestinians as part of this evolving new Middle East. I want to see a two-state solution. I want my country to be freed from the terrible burden of occupation. I want my neighbors to have a normal life. But the Palestinian leadership is going to have to do a much better job convincing average Israelis that if we withdraw, not from there, from here, right from here, I'm not going to get rockets in my living room the day after we withdraw. And right now, the burden of proof is on the Palestinian national movement that it could really offer Israelis peace in exchange for withdrawal. Most Israelis most Israelis, moderate left, center, right, which is to say 80+% of the population, leaving aside Arab Israelis. Almost the entirety of Jewish Israel does not trust the Palestinians.
Yeah, it seems to me, I mean, I'm not, maybe you can help me out. I don't know the new coalition of parties that are coming out for the elections shortly, but it seems to me that virtually no Jewish party is advocating two states right now. And that's at some point that becomes problematic. I'm sure you agree.
I deeply agree. And look, the party that I feel closest to, which is Yesh Atid, Yair Lapid's party, There Is a Future. I think even that name is telling. There aren't too many countries in the world that would have a party that needs to take a name. Don't worry, there really is a future. I think most countries, maybe pre-COVID, take the future for granted. So my party is certainly for a two-state solution. You're right. The vast body of the Israeli political system is deeply skeptical, if not outright opposed, to a two-state solution, and it was not that way in the past. 10 years ago, Netanyahu, as head of the Likud, endorsed the two-state solution. Whether he meant it or not is a different question. But the fact that he felt politically that he had to at least pay lip service to a two-state solution gives you an indication of where Israeli discourse was not that long ago. Today, politicians in the center and the moderate left are hesitant to talk about a Palestinian state.
No, I agree with you completely. The funny thing is, I know you obviously disagree very much with Peter Beinart, but he basically...
No, I don't disagree with Peter. I disagree with people on the left. I disagree with people on the right. I don't have a disagreement with Peter Beinart because I don't have a shared language. I don't have a shared Jewish commitment.
The funny thing is, though, he sort of made the same argument, which is what strikes me. If not him, I don't want to use a buzzword like Peter Beinart that's become a buzzword now that evokes emotions. But I mean, people on the left have said the same thing, which is that acknowledging that Israel doesn't have a vision of two states, and that's what is guiding them towards abandoning their hope in two states and just pushing for democracy. And I would love to hear your response to that. But before I do, I've just been pointed out that it's 1:48. And there's a couple of questions from the audience, and I'm hogging the time, so I would like to give them their due.
Sure.
One of our longtime community members, Herb Silverman, with a deep commitment to humanist Judaism. He's very famous for that, actually. He ran for governor as an atheist, very famously wrote a book about it. So he asks about your religious beliefs, and I know that, and I want to raise this because this was a big part in your book. The role of religion, your own deeply held religious beliefs, what you felt were the religious beliefs of the other side. And I wonder the extent to which you feel religion is a conduit towards possibility or a hindrance towards possibility in your mind.
Oh, it's both. It's both. It is as it's playing out now, it is a definite hindrance on both sides. But there will be no reconciliation between Arabs and Israelis, I believe, without some religious imprimatur, some legitimacy from our respective religious traditions. It's not a coincidence that the Gulf states chose the name Abraham Accords for the peace agreement. That was their name. And they needed some religious category to justify normalization with Israel. And so we're all children of Abraham, et cetera, et cetera. I think we're going to need a religious justification that goes a little bit deeper than we're all children of Abraham. That was a long time ago. And, and I think that there is, both within Judaism and Islam, there are rich resources to mine for peace, for reconciliation, for moderation, for restraint, for humility. Our religious traditions are steeped in this. And that's what we really need to draw on. Now, when I say that there won't be peace, there can't be peace in the Middle East without religion. I'm not ignoring the very negative role that religion plays. The settlement movement was largely impelled by religious enthusiasm. Uh, on the Palestinian side, radical Islam has been a major stream in Palestinian nationalism, going back to the Mufti in the 1920s and 30s. And so religion is has played a deeply destructive role. In the past, the approach of the would-be peacemakers has been to try to neutralize this toxic religious influence by simply bypassing religion altogether. It doesn't work. This is the Middle East. This is not Western Europe. Even in the United States, you can't avoid religion. Certainly in South Carolina, you can't avoid religion. And in the Middle East, religion is the language, the sensibility. It fuels the conflict, and it needs to be part of the solution.
Mm. Yeah, I think so. If you know it, Alex Kay just wrote a great book called on the Birth of Jewish Theology, of Jewish Theocracy, and it was a history of theocratic ideas in Zionism. I don't know if you know it. It's a very
no, I don't.
I think I have it here somewhere. But anyway, it's a very interesting book. But one of his cases, he himself is a religious Zionist, and one of his points is trying to turn religion from a hindrance to a positive role in the future. So I think he would resonate with what you just said. What did Faulkner say? The past is never really dead. It's not even past.
That's right. That's right.
I have an early question that I skipped, and I apologize to her. One of our longtime members, Leah Chase, asks if we can go back a little bit to the beginning of the conversation before time is up, and what led you to leave? Is there any part of Meir Kahane that you're still attracted to? Did you leave him before he died? What's your view of him now, coming from a older perspective? What's your sense of that whole movement and the man himself?
Wholly negative. Wholly, not with an H, with a W. Entirely negative. I see Kahanism, which is what we call it here in Israel. Kahanism is in Hebrew, we have a term, in Judaism, there's the expression, the Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination, the evil temptation that a person has to resist. Kahanism is the Yetzer Hara, the evil temptation of the Jewish soul, of the post-Holocaust Jewish soul. And Kahanism has been responsible for the worst atrocities of Jewish terrorism that have happened here in Israel. It has distorted Judaism. It has reduced Judaism to a religion of vengeance. It has taken the most unpleasant aspects of our 4,000-year tradition, and every religion has its unpleasant aspects. And Kahanism gathered those unpleasant theological bits and fashion them into a coherent ideology or theology. I think Kahanism is more theology than an ideology. And our friend Shaul Magid has written about this. Kahanism is really a theology that's based on vengeance and hatred of the non-Jewish world. And so my judgment on Kahana and Kahanism is definitive. It is without any sentimentality. I don't regret my past. We all carry complicated histories. My life is a journey. All of our lives are journeys. My life has gone through some strange places. That was one of the strange stops. I understand why I needed at age 17, 18 to go through Kahana. I know what he did for me. And in the end, what he really did for me was to be my teacher in reverse. He is my anti-teacher. What Kahana represents, I try to embody the opposite.
Thanks. I'm going to ask you another question in a second. We have just about 5 or 10 minutes left, so I want to remind the audience, those who might have come late, that if they...
Oh, I'm not going anywhere. I'm happy to be, we can talk.
I'll keep you as late as you want. Listen, don't tempt me. I'll keep you on for another hour. But to those of us in the audience who have questions, I'd like to encourage you to please continue to send them to me. I'd be happy to read them aloud to our guest, who was a very, very knowledgeable journalist and activist in Israel for many decades. So please feel free to keep sending those questions along. Since we are, and I'm thrilled that you offered to go past the hour, so thank you for that, and I'm certainly available. But I'd like to know a little bit more about, coming out of the book, your sort of vision of the future, where you see things heading next. I have to say, I did Google you, of course I know your history from Hartman Institute and elsewhere, but I was curious about the discourse. And if people use Google and go to your website and other places, they can see interesting conversations back and forth. One of them that struck me, there was a review in the New York Times of your book by a Palestinian woman, which was critical. And then you responded in Facebook to her. And I found that very interesting. And I wonder if you can comment on that a little bit, and if you see that as a positive step forward for the future or not.
Yeah, well, it was a Palestinian writer, a man, Raja Shahada.
Oh, it was a man, forgive me, I'm sorry, yeah.
Who wrote he wrote a review in the form of a letter to me, which I liked a lot. Look, it was a terrible review. It's like the kind of review in the New York Times that would ruin a writer's year. But the fact that he chose to write it in the form of a letter, it was Dear Yossi, went a long way toward compensating for the negative review. Because look, I had written this book, Dear Palestinian Neighbor, inviting responses. I didn't tell my neighbor what kind of response you should write. I just said, would you honor my outreach by responding? And I got some positive responses. I got lots of negative responses. I got a fair number of hate letters. I got some death threats. I mean, that's all part
of,
that's the package deal. And so when Raja Shahada, who's not only a well-known Palestinian writer, but is actually my favorite Palestinian writer.
Really?
And yeah. He the first narrative that I read from a Palestinian was by him. It was in the 1980s, a book called Sumud, which means Sumud means determination. Yaron, how would you say it in English? Sumud, not moving.
Determination.
Determination.
I think that's good. Yeah.
So he wrote this book Sumud, which is a kind of a diary of life under the occupation in Ramallah, and it was a very important book for me. And so, in my response to Raja Shahada, I said, what I did in this book was, in a way, I was hoping to do for a young Palestinian what you did for a young Yossi. I read your book, and suddenly I had a window into the Palestinian experience. I'm not trying to propagandize you or telling Palestinians that your narrative is wrong. I'm trying to give you a window into my narrative. And isn't that what writers are supposed to do? And I actually wanted to include his review/letter in the new epilogue. And I wrote to the Times, and they asked for an astronomical sum to reprint it. And I thought, it's one thing for me to make the gesture of publishing a really negative review of my book in my book, and I was ready to do that, but I wasn't ready to pay, like $2,000 for the pleasure. So in the end, I didn't include it, but it was a very important experience for me because I think that Shahada absolutely articulated a very normative Palestinian response to my book, but it wasn't the only Palestinian response. He wrote his review as if he were speaking for all Palestinians.
Mm.
And it turns out that there are Palestinians who actually read my book with interest, with anger, with ambivalence, with a whole range of emotions, because they're people. They're not just a national ideological bloc. And so once you get past the gatekeepers, you can really start having a complicated conversation.
That's great. And I assume when you reprinted your book as a paperback with these letters, you tried to choose a range of responses to represent the full range.
Oh, yeah. A friend of mine, when I told a friend of mine that I'm going to be giving the Palestinian letters the last word, he said, well, I hope you'll choose the weakest letters. And I said, well, actually, I'm choosing the strongest letters.
Right.
I tried to give the strongest Zionist narrative that I could. I want to publish Palestinians who are giving a really articulate, powerful counter narrative. And some of the letters I think are just fantastic. I'm really proud of that epilogue. It's a beautiful document of Palestinian sensibilities. And again, it's a range. You know, there are those who responded to me with warmth and gratitude, and others with anger, and it's all in there.
I look forward to it. As you pointed out, I have the hardcover, the original edition, so I'll have to find that. I have a question about the elections coming up. But before I do, I think Yaron wants to ask you a question as well.
Yes. So I want to ask you a question about, you talk about two narratives, and I agree that it's great to listen, but the chance of having one side making a compelling enough case so the other side actually is convinced is not very high. But what do you do then with cases, you know, if you see yourself both as a Zionist and also as, I suppose, a moral person or a not racist person, and then you see things, you know, if like me, you know, I grew up in Israel and I care a lot about the place. But when I read reports such as the one that I saw in Haaretz this weekend about the 3,000 olive trees that were uprooted in Dir Balut, a village, I believe, not very far from where you live, not under the pretext that the Palestinians were terrorists or engaged in terrorist activities, just because they planted the olive trees there about 15 years ago, not yesterday, in a land that Israel calls state-owned land. And we all know that there is very selective enforcement of these rules, meaning Jews who do stuff on so-called state-owned land in the West Bank don't get removed so easily. When I look at this, I'm trying to find a good justification for it, but I really can't. There's no way for me to justify this under anything. I can still believe that everything you said before and you write in your book about why we came back to this place, why we belong there, it doesn't invalidate all of these emotions for me. But I look at it and I say, but if this is the state that I love, then it's very tough love, because there are those things that I can't call myself a moral person and say this is right. I look at it and I say the only justification for it is to make the lives of other people miserable. You don't uproot their olive trees for security reasons, right? It doesn't benefit you in the world of making your life in Jerusalem more secure in any ways. It's just to make their lives more miserable. And so how do we deal with things like that?
We deal with things like that the way we would deal with injustices in any society. You're coming out of 4 years of institutionalized injustice in America that does not invalidate the American ethos, the American dream, certainly not the right of America to exist. It's only Israel that our right to exist is conditional on our moral behavior, and you can tell that next to Peter Beinart. My existence, the ability of 7 million Israeli Jews to thrive and protect themselves in the Middle East, is unconditional. If nothing else, if you're not a Zionist, if you don't have a feeling for this land as the homeland of the Jewish people, this is still the world's largest Jewish community. And very soon, we're probably going to have an absolute majority of the world's Jews. It's here. And so we've got a lot of things to work out. There's a lot that's wrong here. When I see things that are wrong in Israel, it's like when I see things that are wrong in my children. It doesn't make me want to withdraw. I may want to throttle them sometimes, but my commitment is even more passionate. It's something that's wrong in me. When 3,000 olive trees are uprooted, that's not happening in Belgium. That's me. And I have to deal with that. But this place is a real place. And by a real place, I mean it's not a moral drama for Peter Beinart to work out his Jewish ethical dilemmas. This is a real living place. There are real serious ethical dilemmas. Not all of this conflict is my fault. And that's part of the dynamic too. Some of it is. The more the conflict goes on, the more much of this conflict is about me, is my responsibility, is my fault. Not all of it. And I refuse to accept the moral blame for the totality of this conflict. The other side has agency as well. The other side has made decisions over the years that have been catastrophic. We're living the consequences of that. And my responsibility is to try to make sure that I have a government that's reasonable, a government that doesn't just say the word peace, but really means peace, that it actively explores possibilities, openings for peace. And when there isn't a chance for peace, and I don't believe that there really is a chance for peace at this moment, with this generation of Palestinian leaders, or for that matter, with my Israeli leaders at this point. But I would like to see my country, at the very least, not doing harm, not foreclosing options, not shutting off the possibility of solving this conflict. So that's my responsibility as a citizen. That only deepens when things go wrong. And Israel, there's something in the American-Jewish relationship to Israel that needs to grow up. It needs to, and I don't mean you in particular, Yaron. I know that you were articulating a position for the sake of an argument, and I appreciated that. But I think that American Jews, I need American Jews to be more a part of the Israeli debate. I don't want American Jews to be spectators. I want American Jews involved in the nature of Israeli society, in helping me defend Israeli democracy, in establishing religious pluralism so that all parts of the Jewish people will find a reflection of their way of Jewish life, their ethos in our public space. I need American Jews as partners for those struggles. But that's not going to happen if American Jews withdraw because Israel is disappointing them. This is the real world. This is a real place, and let's own it. This is the last shot that we're going to have at a sovereign Jewish state. This is it, and we don't walk away from it, or we don't say, "Well, doesn't look like a two-state solution is happening. Let's go for a one state, like Yugoslavia, like Iraq, like Syria, like Lebanon, one state." And that's the immaturity of a Peter Beinart, which is so reckless, so politically reckless, that it actually becomes a moral flaw.
I really appreciate hearing the interest in having American Jews, and I hope Americans in general, to engage, but Jews in particular, to engage with Israel. Often I've heard Israelis say to American Jews, "You don't live here, keep quiet." And it sounds like you are taking a very different approach than that.
Totally. I mean, look, I'm an American Israeli. It's and I have spent so much of my life since moving to Israel lecturing in the States. I primarily write for American audiences. So I'm heavily invested in the American Jewish-Israeli relationship. It that's what defines me. And this relationship is not just, I think, important for me personally, but when we talk about the future of the Jewish people, we're talking about the two largest concentrations of Jewish life, which is really only two places today. Yes, there's a bit in Argentina and there's a bit in Europe, which is dwindling, and by the end of the century, I think is going to largely disappear. We're talking about the state of Israel and the United States or North America. That's the Jewish people. That's 90+%. And the quality of our relationship is going to determine who we are as a people in the next generation.
And which is the mission of the Hartman Institute, obviously, with which you're so closely affiliated.
Yes, absolutely.
And our mutual friend, we've had Yehuda Kurtzer. For those who don't know, he's the director of the Institute of North America. We've had him here in Charleston, and that's definitely the mission. Yeah, for me, and I assume you want the full range. It's actually, I'm trying to balance your two statements you just made in a single answer, which is interesting to me, which is on the one hand to welcome American Jews to participate, but on the other hand to reject Peter. It seems to me, I'm on the left, but I like it when Americans and American Jews in particular, whatever their position is, it makes me so happy when they engage on Israel, whether they advocate for more settlements in the heart of Hebron, or whether they advocate for democracy for everybody in a single state. I'm just happy that they're part of the conversation. That's certainly at the college.
Democracy for everyone in a single state is a code word for the dismantling of the Jewish majority state.
No, I hear you. I hear why you disagree with it, but
it's more than a disagreement. I cannot engage with fellow Jews in a reasoned discussion about whether my country has a right to exist or not.
What about those who advocate annexation and without extending democracy? What would you say is that part of the conversation for you?
Well, it's a good question. It is by default because that's such a big part of, it's still a minority, but it is a big part of the Israeli population. And look, I have to deal with the Israeli discourse. I deal with Arab Israelis who are anti-Zionist and sit in the Knesset. That's part of my discourse as well. But in terms of Israelis who want to impose a one state without offering democracy, that's a camp that I am committed as a citizen to resisting. And that's my discourse, is that we are engaged in a very heated ideological conflict. It's expressed, fortunately, through democratic means. It's expressed through parliament. So far, we still have the upper hand. So far, the annexationists have failed. If the annexationists succeed, and if we really become formally one state, then we have to really rethink what the options are. But what outrages me about people like Peter Beinart and Jewish Voice for Peace is the cavalier way in which they simply say, well, I guess that just didn't work out, so let's just dismantle this country that Jews waited for 2,000 years to return to, that we've sacrificed so much to create. And Israel offends my democratic American sensibilities, and therefore you have no right to exist. That is a conversation I'm not ready to have.
I suspect, I won't speak for anyone else, but I suspect if he was here, he would probably resist your description of him as cavalier in that way.
I read, his 8,000 word essay about a one-state solution, which contained absolutely zero angst about giving up the dream of a Jewish state. You write 8,000 words and there's no regret, there's no sense or maybe a little bit of fear and hesitation. If his hand would have trembled when he wrote that essay, I would respect him more. You're putting the lives of 7 million Jews in danger in the world's most unstable and dangerous region. And all you can do is say, oh, there's nothing to worry about. Even Hamas is ready to live in peace with the Jews. And I read that and I say, this passes for serious discourse in the American Jewish community about Israel and Zionism. Peter Beinart is actually a voice in the American Jewish community. That for me is deeply upsetting.
We got a new question from someone in the audience who asks
I hope I'm not being too reticent about my opinion about where
this is great.
Where I hold on Peter Beinart.
We love strong opinions here, and as you said, and it was my favorite thing. You've said many things that were very stimulating, but the thing that I loved the most was your comment that the importance of being changed, even if not persuaded, is so important in these dialogues. That's the thing I'm going to be using that with accreditation to you, which I think is so important. The importance.
I'm going to write that line down too, because I'll
change if not persuaded. Yeah, I love that. You and I came up with it together. We can own it together. Somebody asked, you are Orthodox, or at least you present as Orthodox. And
traditional.
And they want to know if you feel that you have standing, or others like you have standing, to try to, the way they word it is, try to help convince American Orthodox Jews to have a more nuanced view on Israel. I think the assumption, the hava amina of that question is that American Orthodox Jews tend to be very right-wing.
Very right-wing, with some significant exceptions,
sure,
but yes.
Sure, but do you feel like you have some standing or ability, or are you making an effort to try to have play in that community, is the question.
I have over the years. I find that I'm invited less and less to more mainstream Orthodox synagogues because I make them uneasy. I'm a Zionist. I say lots of the right things. I seem to be okay. I seem to be a reasonably normative Jew. And yet I'll say things that will just really upset them. And I've had people come up to me afterwards and say, you're a good guy. Why do you have to say those things? Why do you have to talk about the occupation? There is no occupation. And why do you have to talk about the Palestinians? There's no Palestinians. So the people that we are not occupying are not Palestinians. And I can't have that discourse. And so most or many Orthodox shuls are much more comfortable not having their Shabbos disturbed by a troubler of Israel. And why? It's almost like I'm a dissonant voice in the gates. They're not going to invite a Peter Beinart, but someone like me they might invite, and then they're stuck with like a whole Shabbos, of having this guy as a scholar in residence. What's he going to say at Suda Shlishit? God help us. and so the anxiety and the angst, it's just not worth it. It's not worth it for them. It's not worth it for me. I don't really enjoy being in right-wing spaces. I spoke in a right-wing shul, an Orthodox shul, I won't say where, a couple of years ago. And I spoke about Soros and Trump, the Trump circle, and the dog whistles about Soros. Somebody calls out, really upset, and said, "But Soros is a terrible guy." And I said to him, "Listen, I actually am not a big George Soros fan, and I'm certainly not a big fan of the Jew George Soros. But that's not the point. The point is using him for anti-Semitic purposes. And how do you not see that? How do you not call your own political camp to account for indulging in anti-Semitism? Is it only the other camp that's guilty of anti-Semitism? And that question applies whether you sit in the left or the right. Is it only the other camp whose anti-Semitism upsets you? So
They say only Nixon can go to China, so maybe only Yossi can go to the Orthodox shuls and bring the message.
Yeah, well, maybe when I was 19, I would have been more acceptable in Orthodox shuls.
We need to wrap up soon, but I want to give you the last word in a second. But I have to say, when I was last in the West Bank, I went on the Encounter program, which I'm sure you know of. And there was a Palestinian we met with who said to us something to the effect of, we want you guys to disappear and you want us to disappear, but none of us are going to disappear, so we have to figure out how to get along. And I thought to myself, what a sad sentence. I thought to myself, God, I don't want you to disappear, and I wish you didn't want us to disappear. Like, why do we have to wish each other disappearing? It was such a sad statement to me. And
I know of almost no one in this land, Israeli or Palestinian, who wouldn't be thrilled to wake up tomorrow morning and read that everyone on the other side got visas to Australia. Everyone's leaving. They're reopening the airport. They're making a special dispensation in COVID. They're reopening Ben Gurion so all the Jews can leave or all the Palestinians can leave. The other side would be thrilled. I don't care if you're a leftist, a rightist. Almost everyone in this conflict would be relieved. And so what that person said to you is actually, in the context of of an existential conflict, is actually quite a reasonable statement. When you're in a life and death conflict, and again, this is something that it's very hard for American Jews to really understand. American Jews more and more tend to think of this as an occupation, and Israelis think of it as an existential situation. Very different ways of looking at it. When you look at a conflict as an existential threat, then even moral lapses, like you were speaking about, your own, okay, no, malasot, okay, bad things happen. But it's basically a life and death conflict, and if we lower our guard, they will massacre us. Now, that's a normative Israeli perspective. I share it to some extent, maybe a little less than I used to, but I still do. Certainly emotionally, if not quite politically. And so the reality of this conflict is that it is, for both sides, it's existential. And this is, I think, really important to understand if we're ever going to try to heal this wound, is that two things. One is that for both sides, all of this little land between the river and the sea, the Jordan River and the Mediterranean, all of this land belongs to me. And the me is if I'm a Palestinian or if I'm an Israeli, it all belongs to me. All of this land, that, you use the term West Bank. I don't call it the West Bank. It's true. For me, it's Judea and Samaria. I mean, that's what we say in Hebrew, Yudav Shomron, but it's not alien territory. It's not occupied territory. Yes, I'm occupying the Palestinians, but I do not believe I'm occupying Judea and Samaria. I'm ready to compromise. I'm ready to withdraw, to contract and make space for the counterclaim, because there's another people in this land and they have the right to national determination. But that doesn't mean that this land doesn't belong to me. Just as any Palestinian you'll speak to will tell you that Haifa and Jaffa is Palestine. Of course it's Palestine. And I have no problem with that. I accept the fact that for Palestinians, Jaffa and Haifa is Palestine. Because for me, Hebron is the land of Israel. Hebron is more the land of Israel than Tel Aviv. Tel Aviv is a baby city. 100 years old. Hebron, Jews have lived on and off in Hebron for 4,000 years. There's no place on this planet where I feel a deeper rootedness than in Hebron. But the price of imposing Israeli sovereignty on Hebron is morally too high for me and practically too high. I want to extricate myself from this conflict. I don't want another 100 years of conflict. And so I'm ready to pay a very high price in land that belongs to me. That's an Israeli concession. Just as Palestinians, in accepting the state of Israel, if and when Palestinians do accept the state of Israel, that's a big concession for them. We're giving up part of Palestine. And Palestinians say it all the time. We lost 79% of Palestine, which is now the state of Israel. What does that mean? It's theirs. I have no problem with that. Between the river and the sea, Palestine will be free. Go ahead. Go for it. It's all yours. But it's also all mine. Now, what do we do with that? Do we fight for another 100 years? Or do we sit down and do what neither of us wants to do, which is impose on our narrative, on our being, a wound, a deep wound, to cut this land. I can't bear the thought of this not being Israel. I can't bear it. And yet I'm going to have to if we're going to find a way out.
Well, thank you so much. We are now half an hour past and everyone's enthralled. This has been so powerful and so helpful for all of us.
Oh, thank you. I really enjoyed engaging with you and Yaron and all of you. I'm very grateful that you had me on, and really a pleasure to meet you all.
It was wonderful. Thank you so much. Yaron, do you want to take the last word?
I don't have any last word beyond just saying thank you. This was really great. I learned from it a lot. Yeah, we are going to have more and more of these discussions. I don't know what is the solution. There's probably isn't one anytime soon that anyone can see. At least when I teach this in a history of Israel or Arab-Israeli conflict courses, that's my sort of starting point. That I'm not saying there is no solution. I tell my students, I don't know that there is a solution. That's what I say, because maybe there is one somewhere out there,
right,
that someone hasn't, that I don't know of. But talking is always better than any of the alternatives. So that has to continue.
Inshallah.
And to our guests again, this will be uploaded to our website and to Facebook. And the book, the most recent book we've been discussing, Letters to My Palestinian Neighbor, you'll want to get the paperback edition that has the extra letters from Palestinians in response to our guest that he was talking about. I assume that's widely available on your website and Amazon and so on.
Yeah.
Thank you, Yossi.
Okay.
Thank you. Really a pleasure, Josh.
Thank you.
Be well. Be well,
Be well.
everyone.
Stay safe.
You too.